Can you believe this beautiful, strange mosaic of green coffee? All different types, shapes, some variety and processing difference, some of them different stages in the process. And today I'm going to talk about all these. I'm going to do a little deep dive into green coffee and the different appearance it has. And I want to point out there's like some things you can figure out by looking at green coffee, some things you can't. It used to be before cupping, coffee was evaluated just by looking at the green. And, I don't want to be dismissive of that knowledge. I think it was important to start tasting coffee, see what it tasted like, and decide value from there. But, people were very, very good about looking at green coffee. But that also led to certain forms of bias, like big bean bias. Europeans would evaluate and value, for example, Colombia coffee because it was 18 screen plus, large bean, because that's what mattered to them. And the cup was sort of secondary. So anyway, I want to show you some inspiration that I have historically with one of my sort of prized possessions from my coffee history collection. So this is a promotional piece created by this company who I can't find a lot of information on. I don't think they were terribly important as a Santos-based coffee trader. I'm not going to try to pronounce their name correctly. I'm just not going to try. But you'll see they use the Telex codes, Acme, Bentley's, or private code. And you could reach them at Febrex. And this is just a wonderful thing. I just love it both for the way they represent themselves and for the information they're trying to share, and doing that in this sort of diorama way, which, as an old guy, really, I like it. It's a neat way of learning in the non-digital era. I especially like this guy here. I think he's just got a great style. He looks a little bit like a robot. Actually, his brother there definitely looks like a robot. We're not ruling that out. But, and I also can't quickly and off the top of my head translate these, but I think they're very interesting. These are different qualities and grades of sizes, separation sizes. I think this is really interesting that mocha is a term they use for Peaberry, large and small Peaberry, and what they call Bourbon coffee, nice Arabica. And then they're saying, they can supply any type of coffee. And there's a really interesting little tiny Bourbon, something called Murta, which might correspond to a variety I've seen in coffee gardens called Murta de Hoja Grande. And I'm not really sure. And Maragogipe, which we know and is a Brazilian spontaneous mutation. I really think that they are employing children here. It's probably a grandson or son in the office. They've sort of mocked up a coffee branch. And this is all sort of like a trip, and an educational trip to Coffee Land for people who couldn't go. And when you had to go on steamship to Brazil, that was quite a trek. So, this is the inspiration for my little homage here. So we're going to look at this tray of green coffee first, and this isn't the most exciting tray, honestly. This is mostly coffees that we carry. So I guess I'm saying our coffee's not exciting, but these are like good coffees, different good coffees that have been approved. But sometimes the coffees that fall outside of that, in some cases here we have like parchment and stuff, but some of these sort of unusual origins and different processes that, frankly, aren't that good and sort of questionable are kind of interesting. They're definitely interesting to me. We have some commercial grades here to look at and stuff. But let's start with the nice coffee, supposedly nice. And I wanted to point out, this is not like technical. I'm not green grading here. We're just kind of gawking at coffee, seeing what we can learn. One thing that's interesting and sort of, you know, historically about looking at green coffee is that there was a time before cupping when this is how you bought coffee. You, as my friend Scott Reed used to call it, eye cupping. You just look at green coffee and try to determine the quality. And, well, that is part of cupping now with grading, etc. And, you know, there are some things you can learn. You know, it's become more circumspect what the value is to look at green coffee and try to decide if it's good or not. But I think it's still quite interesting to look at green coffee. Just to flesh that out a little bit more, cupping supposedly was invented in San Francisco by a firm named C.E. Bickford. It's one of the first documented notes about blind cupping, a tasting process where you evaluate the quality of coffee and its value and what you want to pay for it by not focusing on the size of the coffee bean in particular, but looking at, you know, just determining what it tastes like. Now that seems obvious to us now, but there was a time when coffee was more dominated by European traders who really cared about the appearance. They wanted big coffee beans. And coffee, you know, like in Colombia, you have Supremo grade, Excelso grade. It was valued for bean size. And, you know, I think cup quality had something to do with it. It had to. But roasters wanted a very good, even roast and a good appearance because that's how they sold coffee. Whereas in the United States, if it was marketed in a can, people didn't care so much. You could put any picture on the can of whatever you wanted. So cupping didn't always exist. Cup testing. And let's start with this coffee because this is a Huehuetenango coffee from Peña. And, you know, it's a particularly good example of high cup quality from small and irregular coffee beans. Here, you know, we'd call this at one time estate grade because there's even a Peaberry right there. And a variety of different bean sizes. It's probably graded at 15 screen and larger. And this is the type of coffee that would not have passed muster and would have had a lower value to some traders until cup testing happened. And areas like Antigua, but later on, Huehuetenango were sort of, quote, discovered, unquote, as being really high quality origins through just focusing on the cup taste. Here is a kind of odd coffee. This is a honey coffee, so you can see from looking at the wet processed coffee over here from Guatemala, and this Antigua right here. You see the yellowish cast to a lot of beans. That's because of honey processing. But what's also, this sort of has a couple things going for it. It's a Pacamara coffee. So that's a coffee from that was developed mainly in El Salvador, combined from Pacas, which is a family name. It's still a family producing coffee in El Salvador. And they had a certain type of Bourbon that's had some good qualities. I think it had some form of resistance and was better in the wind, which is a big issue in El Salvador. And Maragogipe, which was a spontaneous mutation of Bourbon that happened in Brazil and was, again, favored for its large bean. But one thing you'll see with it is, like, let's say here is the typical sort of Arabica crease here in a coffee bean. And Maragogipe, and therefore Pacamara, will often have this, especially this one, this kind of like toothy grin in the crease in the coffee bean. And these sort of deformations here. It can make it a little bit challenging to roast. In El Salvador, they did some work to try to assist roasters because it can be a very nice coffee, but if you can see this one, if I can get it up on its edge, you see a kind of curve in it from the side. And it's they'd call this kind of canoe shape. And it would lead to some problems in roasting, as well as just generally a variety of different shapes. You see even Peaberry here and stuff. And that variety isn't bad. It just couldn't make each coffee bean roast a little differently. It's a challenge of Pacamara. Part of that variety can be that Pacamara is not a very stable variety of coffee. It tends to regress into Maragahipe and tupacas when you plant it. So now this is only funny because it's a wet processed coffee from Chiapas, and it's something I marvel over because I'm going to just zip back here to this coffee from northern Guatemala. I've been on this farm in Quilco where I'm standing on a hillside looking across the side to the other valley, seeing the coffee planted, which is this coffee, this Mexican Chiapas. And it's so strange that this coffee coming from the exact same environment, more or less, on opposing hillsides of a valley, one is a Mexican coffee and one is a Guatemala coffee. I just kind of marvel at this kind of craziness that we give nationality to coffee trees, and in cases like that, they're literally right across from each other. So this is a Mexican Chiapas, I guess we'll say. And it's just right next to the border of Guatemala. And one thing here I would say, this is what I learned when I started coffee, and I'm not sure this is so true, but this type of bean is very typical for Typica. Of course, different varieties produce all kinds of shapes, but this is something I'd look at and be like, that looks a lot like Typica. And this is the shape that I learned you would see a lot in Bourbon. And it makes some sense because, well, you don't see a lot of Typica in Guatemala, Huehuetenango. You do see quite a lot of old Typica still in Mexico, which is amazing because it's not very disease resistant. And with La Roya, the coffee rust, it's been very... Okay, so from Chiapas, Mexico, notice that this coffee has a kind of elongated shape, a lot like this Typica, supposed Typica bean. And this is a really interesting coffee with an interesting story. What you see is a long form, generally, kind of narrow and kind of football shape, kind of a bit pointed on the ends. And this is called Java, or Java, grown in Nicaragua. So there's a big story behind this. I'll try to make it as short as I can. Supposedly the origin of this coffee is from Java. It's called Abyssinia, and when it's grown in Java, in Indonesia. As you know, coffee didn't originate in Indonesia. It came via India, brought by the Dutch, planted outside Batavia in an area called Bogor, which is between modern-day Jakarta and Bandung. It's now a tea area. And it was sort of noted that this coffee might have some resistance to a problem in Africa called coffee berry disease. So it was brought to Cameroon, where it was planted, reproduced, and bred. Eventually, after something like 20, 25 years, it was spread into some of the research gardens, and it was brought to Cartier in Costa Rica, and from there kind of went around Central America to some degree. It was known for not being particularly disease resistant to Roya, etc., and there's not really coffee berry disease in Central America, thankfully, at this point, but it was also known for needing low inputs, not a lot of organic fertilizer. It would do well with very little. Anyway, somebody that I know, Erwin Meersch, the Meersch family is well known in coffee, supposedly purchased some of this coffee after a local coffee variety source, a seed source, went out of business, and somebody sold them several kilograms supposedly of seed. So I visited here in their farm, Limoncillo, in 2005 and 2006 to see how this coffee was doing, and it really looked different. Had a kind of Christmas tree shape as it grew, and even in the early years, we noted the cup was very nice. It was kind of floral, sort of had an interesting, kind of slightly green, fresh green, slightly lime acidity to me, a bit of light body. And since that time, it's been planted around Nicaragua and other Central America countries. We buy it from Antigua and Guatemala, and it's really nice variety. So it's interesting how there's a whole story, international story behind that coffee. And now let's move on to another, probably not so exciting story, but I think very interesting, because one of the main things in coffee breeding and varieties is to find disease resistance, which helps farmers use less herbicides and pesticides and chemicals, so it's great. But a lot of breeding was typically done without a lot of regard for cup quality. Nonetheless, if it's a choice between producing, fancy coffee or just producing coffee so you have something to sell, it makes a lot of sense to have breeding programs for disease resistance as well as producing a good volume of coffee. This coffee is called Parainema, and it was developed by Ecafe, the institute in Honduras. And so this was a selection from Sarchimor, which is a cross between Híbrido de Timor, which has Robusta genes. It's a Robusta Arabica or Arabusta cross, and Via Sarchi, which is a nice, I think, Bourbon selection. And the hope was that it would have some disease resistance. This was actually, the Sarchimor came from the Research Institute in Portugal. I think that is Syrah, if I'm correct. And there isn't really one type of Sarchimor. There's sort of many different crosses that have been made. One is called Iapar from Brazil, for example. But Parainema is this kind of large bean one. And this is actually one Arabica coffee that has some Robusta inputs that from time to time we offer, because it can have a very nice kind of green herbal quality that I find very positive. When some of those coffees are really low grown, that's not so positive. But it can be, and Parainema from Honduras can sometimes be nice. Quite often it's not. So there's an interesting story behind it. And again, it's that, search to support producers to get them a good livelihood by producing disease-resistant and higher yield varieties, which who can argue with that? This is Colombia, and it's from Buesaco, which is in Nariño. Colombia coffees we really like Caturas from Colombia. A lot of them are different types of hybrids like Variedad Colombia or Castillo. Castillo is the sort of latest disease-resistant variety. Some controversy around how that cups. Not huge fans of Castillo, but I'm sure some of the coffees we offer have a blend of all three: Catura, Variedad Colombia, which is a hybrid that does have Robusta genes, and Castillo. There's been many Castillos. What tends to happen is it's not just one version or one thing called Castillo. There'll be many. So here's another Pacamara. This one is wet process. So if you remember the yellowish appearance of the other one we were looking at from Guatemala, it's another Pacamara. And again, you can see the kind of types of deformation. This one might be one of those elusive tri-beans. Sometimes the coffee cherry, instead of having two beans and the flat sides face each other, it has three, and they form this kind of angle that you can see here. And you'll see some of in fact, here's another tri-bean. That's interesting. But you'll see some of the unique shape that comes from the Maragihipe. Kind of a bit ugly, honestly, but that will show up in the Pacamara, and that certainly makes sense. Let's move on to some Brazil coffee. Now notice we go from a kind of greenish, bluish, I would say, cast to something a little more yellow. And that's because it's a natural coffee. It's a dry process coffee. And with that, you're drying the whole cherry with the pod on, with the whole skin on. And then in a single step, you're taking at the dry mill, or in a mill, you're tearing off the whole outer skin that's and the fruit layer, as well as the parchment that's all attached to each other, and you're doing it in one step. And so you tend to have this remaining higher level of silver skin that's remaining, and that's what comes off your coffee when you roast as chaff. And the chaff that doesn't come off oftentimes is the chaff that's still bound up in the crease of your coffee bean. But all of it is the same skin that's in between the parchment layer and the coffee bean itself. It's something that looks a little defective here. It's kind of a little bit old. Let me see. Oh yeah, this is 2021 crop. So these are getting a little bit old. And if you look at that chart I showed, that promotional poster artwork, you'll see how coffee turns yellow as it ages. We'll look at some aged coffee. This is a kind of commercial, low specialty, let's just say, coffee from Brazil. This is sold using the old designations of strictly soft. It's 2-3 strictly soft 1617 fine cup FC. And there's all these sort of acronyms for how they used to sell sort of commercial to low specialty type blender Brazils. You'll see kind of small bean, irregular, it's not bad. That is, I don't have the year on that one. So we're gonna go from Brazil to Kenya, and I don't know how I can just look at that and know that's a Kenya. I am not sure. So a lot of these are Bourbon type coffees developed by a company way back in the 30s called Scott Labs, and somehow I think it sounds modern because they'll be called SL28 and SL34. It sounds like some sort of new hybrid, but they're quite old. They have excellent cups, and they were made for different climates, different soils, different environments in different parts of Kenya. And the most popular that were planted over the years were the SL28 and 34. You'll see like 80, 90-year-old trees actually at times of these in Kenya. They can produce a long time given the traditional ways that they prune and feed the tree. Next is a Peaberry. So Peaberry, you might know this, but I'll say it. So with a flat bean, you have two seeds in one cherry, and the flat side faces the other flat side, and they form a rounded cherry. And when one of those fails to develop, the remaining seed can develop into a rounded Peaberry shape, which will be a smaller cherry generally. What's really funny, I was traveling once in Sumatra, and somebody says, "Oh, look, that's a Peaberry tree." And I was like, there is no Peaberry tree. What are you talking about? Typically Peaberries, if you're looking at a coffee tree and you're kind of opening up cherries, checking them out, you'll see Peaberries more on the ends of branches, in my experience, and the kind of tops of trees. So they seem to be located in the places where the nutrition is harder to deliver to the fruit. And maybe that's why one of the seeds fails to grow. But sure enough, this tree just had a high number of peaberries on it. Turns out, when I was thinking about it later, this tree was right along the roadside, and it was sort of on a little drop off, and the roots were like half gone. It only probably had half of a root system, and I think it was having a high percentage of peaberries simply because of that, because they were failing to, could not deliver the kind of nutrition that would have all the coffee succeed in developing seeds. So this is a Rwanda Bourbon. They call them Bourbon. There's different varieties. In Rwanda, traditionally, there was one called Kent's, which came from India. India's always had a very strong coffee breeding program, and I believe some of the SLs from Kenya were also Indian origin, as well as, I think I'll mention it when we look at some Indonesia coffee, the India breeding programs and how they influenced other countries. What do we have next? Well, we're next door in Burundi now. So very similar plant seed stock being used in both of those countries. Although at this point, Rwanda is way more sophisticated. And I see we're getting into some naturals now. And can you see why? What you're seeing is the yellowish cast, and a lot of that is coming from the fact that so much of the silver skin remains in the coffee. I mean, you can see, let me see, like this seed appears to have, half of the silver skin and half not. Maybe we can find another better example. This one has it completely removed, so it looks more like a washed coffee. And that, oftentimes that's the appearance, is that the remaining silver skin, you'll see it here, but it's a little bit whiter, will have a yellow cast because of this long contact time between the fruit and the silver skin as it dries in the full cherry pod. This is from Ethiopia. I think I can kind of tell that because of this sort of, a lot of coffee with a kind of elongated form. Like these narrow, small, elongated. God, if we were still, evaluating coffee only on bean size, Ethiopia would be ignored in a lot of cases, and we'd be missing one of the best coffees in the world. I think that's interesting. This is another natural from Limu. I think you can tell. All the yellowish cast, even sort of reddish. And of course, because of this, your naturals, when you roast them, are going to produce a lot more silver skin, a lot more chaff is going to come off. And, a lot of times you got to keep your roaster clean because of that. Here we have another natural from Guji area. It's from Sawana Wet Mill, which I was just visiting in January. And here's an Ethiopia washed. And this one is from the West. Actually, this is not strictly washed, it's washed style. It's machine washed, where you're forcing off the, that's a loud truck, where you're forcing off the pulp off of the coffee, and then you do a small fermentation. It's not traditional washed, but can produce a very nice cup when it's done well. It can not be so attractive when it's rushed through the process. But if you actually ferment after doing machine washing, it can be quite good, what they call eco-pulper. This is kind of interesting. This looks much more like a washed coffee, and I think it is a rule of thumb with me, but I've seen this before where a coffee, let's say, we're gonna do some eye cupping here, that it has, like, let's go to the Senna coffee here, the reddish yellow color is, in my opinion, oftentimes a coffee that has taken longer to dry. It's been on the drying beds in cherry form for 25 days, let's say, 20 to 30 days. And the cup flavor will tend to be more fruit forward, sometimes even a little bit winey, or in extreme cases kind of boozy like an anaerobic, when you have very long drying times on the drying tables. And then you get naturals from zones that are much hotter and can dry coffee quicker, and they look something like this. They look much more like a wash. Ignore that this one is this is a defect. That's that looks like insect bitten. Anyway, we'll leave it in there because it's interesting. So that to me corresponds to a flavor that's a little bit more like a washed coffee, higher acidity, definite fruit, and it's a coffee I really like. I think these sort of quicker drying naturals, of course they're not machine dried or anything like that, can be very nice. And we have all this focus now on anaerobic, et cetera, Excuse me, I gotta back up just a little. But not a lot on really managing the drying time on the beds. You know, maybe that's because it's sun powered and there's not a lot you can do about it. But some in Ethiopia, what's very common to see these days is people covering the coffee in the middles of the days. You'll see this in a lot of East Africa with shade net in order to slow down the drying a little bit in places where they could dry in 7 days, and that would be just way too fast. So we're gonna look at some Indonesia coffees here, and actually this one I can't quite explain. So I might skip it. I think something happened to this sample because it is a little bit old and it started to turn yellow. Well, it's from 2020. You know, these are trays I assembled some time ago in 2022 during pandemic, you know, not much to do. And finally finished labeling them last week, you know, 2 years. Anyway, I don't think this really represents it because it's turned quite yellow, and maybe that's just the instability of processing, but it is a wet hulled coffee. It's a Lingtong Peaberry, although you see a lot of other shapes. And, you know, one of the things you see a lot is, here's some flat bean and stuff, because the grading machine can't totally separate only for the rounded shape. There is a separate machine at the mill that's much better at this, but not all mills have that and use it. But let's go to next door, because this is here's a couple other Indonesia coffees, and we'll get to a wet hulled coffee. This is actually a wet processed Sumatra, fully washed, fermented, and I'll show you a wet hulled. Let's skip down the line a little. Peaberry, sorry, we have a Peaberry there, and we have the India. It's a nice Arabica. And this is sort of funny. This is a wet hulled coffee, and you can kind of see a difference. So what is wet hulling? Giling basa. It's typical to Sumatra and parts of Indonesia like Sulawesi. It's a process that's unusual because coffee is normally dried in parchment with an outer layer, or the natural with the full cherry all surrounding the coffee. But in parts of Indonesia, what they do is they dry the coffee part way, then they take it to a special type of huller that's oftentimes run by just like a massive like truck engine, like 4-cylinder truck or car engine, because it needs a lot of friction. And they just, while it's still wet, they pull off the outer layer, which doesn't really want to come off at that point. That's why they need this massive amount of friction. Then you've got just the green bean, just like this. It's whitish, it's swollen up, and it goes right out to dry on the beds or the patio. So very unusual to have coffee dry unprotected like this. Normally it's in an outer layer that's then going to be taken off in a dry mill. And that's the wet hulling process that produces some of the foresty flavors, some of the kind of mossy notes and rustic aspects. Now, what's funny is Sumatra coffee has been very expensive. The internal market there is very strong. There's a lot of competition. There's less yield from the coffee there. And what's happened is to get that wet hulled flavor that people like Starbucks really like, because Starbucks does buy a lot of Sumatra. People have seen an opportunity and started doing wet hulling in places like Tanzania, believe it or not, or in this case, Timor. So that's actually an East Timor wet hulled coffee, which is not traditional, but it's what the market wants. And, you know, if Starbucks is going to buy 30 containers of your Timor wet hulled, you know, you'll do it. The next coffee here is kind of funny. It's another global sort of case where you have a Costa Rica, high-yield Costa Rica variety called Costa Rica 95. It's a Cat Timor. It's crossed, it has inputs from a Timor hybrid that has Robusta and crossed with Caturra, I do believe. So this was a hybrid developed in Costa Rica to fight coffee leaf rust, but also it was sort of cynically derived to plant coffee in full sun without any shade trees and get like maximum yield. And these Costa Rica 95 trees were known to take chemical fertilizer very well and to burn out, like to just sort of die out in 10 years. So when I started in coffee in the late 90s, this was very controversial. People saw it as an issue environmentally with using chemical fertilizers, and a very kind of cynical way for people to produce a so-called Arabica specialty coffee, but do it on a large scale by kind of multinationals that were really promoting this. And, you know, we immediately gravitated, I don't know if we ever bought coffee in that, from those types of sources. I can pretty much say we didn't. What happened around that time is there was a counter movement where small farmers started developing their own tiny mills, and they would have nice varieties like Caturra planted, and they sort of took control of their own production, and that was really what we were buying at the time, and continue to buy. Dan was just there this week selecting coffees from what they call micro mills. Now, the next few that are kind of funny looking are decafs. And unfortunately, I stuck another decaf that I want to refer to on another tray. But, you know, decafs are so tough to roast because you're starting with this baseline of a fairly brown coffee. And color just doesn't work in roasting decafs. They're very hard to judge. And at the same time, they often don't have the audible crack that other coffees have. So this one here is a Colombia that's what you call a chemical decaf, but I'll explain that. It's a direct contact method where they are trying to wash the caffeine out of caffeinated coffee using a solvent. In this case, this is an alternative that people found sort of acceptable called ethyl acetate. They marketing name sugarcane decaf, which is pretty ridiculous, but you can derive ethyl acetate from sugarcane as a byproduct of sugarcane processing, and since it comes from a sort of food product, people find that kind of acceptable. It tends to produce a very fruity flavor. What we like more is indirect decafs, which are Swiss water, and this is one. I'm not sure if we can appreciate how kind of brown this is compared. Let me just try to go between, a greenish coffee, which is this, which kind of looks fairly gray in this light, and this, which is quite different. I'll tell you what, let's back up for a second here. There we go. Maybe this will show on this side. We were looking at the kind of grayish green, a little bit of the Timor wet hulled, and the more brown of a decaf. This is a Sumatra. This is a Honduras decaf that we sent up. So all of our decafs we send custom lots, and next to it is an Ethiopia decaf. These aren't the most recent ones since I made these trays a while ago. But you can see the challenge with decaf. Here's green coffee. This is the Kenya here, and you can see how you start with a different color. And we have a lot of tutorials and stuff on how to roast decaf to overcome those things, but it's still a challenge. I wouldn't jump into home roasting and do your first batch of decaf, but it's interesting because decaf has gotten really good. We're really happy because we send really good coffee to Swiss Water to process, and our results have been, quite incredible. So I wanted to counter that. I'm going to jump to the other tray. Shouldn't have stranded this coffee over here. So when I say it's chemical decaf, this is one here, and you see this sort of odd yellowish color to it. So this is what most decaf is still a direct chemical product. And this is methylene chloride, It's a process. A lot of this is done by a plant, KVW, in Germany, actually. And this is something we don't carry. We don't do methylene chloride. We did when I didn't know any better, and this was the only option. But this is not, it's supposed to be safe. It's supposed to be completely out of the coffee, and you're going to roast it, and it will volatilize in roasting. But why, when you get a great cup from a filtration method like Swiss water that has no chemicals used, why do this? But this is how a lot of the world's more basic decafs are done, and probably some degree of specialty decaf. So that's methylene chloride. So we've covered a lot, and it's like 30 minutes, and I have a whole nother tray to do. I didn't even know I could talk this much. So we're gonna move on to tray 2 in part 2 of gawking at green coffee. Okay.